A sodden meadow beside the River Thames, the sky a stubborn slate grey, and a throng of barons in chainmail shuffling about like impatient schoolchildren, waiting for the bell to ring. It's June 15th, 1215, and the air smells of damp wool, horse manure, and the faint promise of rebellion. In the middle of this soggy circus stands King John, not the jovial Robin Hood fooling monarch of legend, but a sullen penny-pinching ruler whose idea of a good time is raising taxes so high that even the squirrels start filing complaints. This, dear viewers, is the stage where one of history's most famous peace treaties, though it looked more like a hostage negotiation at the time, was thrust onto a parchment, and against all odds, changed the world. Welcome to What is Magna Carta? Setting the scene. Let's rewind a bit. England in the early 13th century was a feudal patchwork quilt, stitched together by loyalty, land, and a whole lot of fear. The king sat at the top, supposedly ordained by God, but in practice his power depended on how well he could keep his nobles happy, or at least terrified enough not to revolt. King John, who ascended the throne in 1199 after the death of his charismatic brother Richard the Lionheart, managed to do the opposite of keep happy. He lost Normandy to France, squandered royal riches on failed military campaigns, and then, to make ends meet, started squeezing his barons for every penny they could spare. Scutage, payments in lieu of military service, forest fines, and arbitrary wardships that felt less like feudal dues and more like medieval extortion. If you thought modern tax season was bad, imagine receiving a royal decree that said, pay up or I'll confiscate your favorite hunting falcon and then your castle. The barons, a proud lot used to fighting alongside the king in crusades and border skirmishes, began to whisper that perhaps the crown needed a reminder. The king's authority wasn't absolute. What was the aim? The barons didn't set out to write a constitution. They wanted a practical solution to stop John from bleeding them dry. Their aim was simple, if you can call it that. Force the king to agree to a set of written promises that limited his arbitrary powers, protected their traditional rights, and, most importantly, gave them a legal recourse when the crown overstepped. In other words, they wanted a contractual get-out-of-jail-free card, but written on parchment instead of printed on a monopoly board. What was in the original? Now let's crack open that original Magna Carta, Latin for Great Charter, and see what the barons actually managed to squeeze into its 63 clauses. Yes, 63. Think of it as a medieval terms and conditions document, only with fewer loopholes and more sword-waving. First, the famous Clause 39. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. In plain English, you can't just toss someone in the dungeon because you don't like their hat. Justice must follow the law, not the king's whim. Clause 40 mirrors that sentiment. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. Imagine a royal clerk trying to charge you a fee just to hear your case. Clause 40 says, nice try, but no. Other clauses tackled everyday feudal grievances. Limits on scutage, protection for widows from forced marriage, guarantees that heirs wouldn't be ruined by excessive relief payments, the feudal inheritance tax, and rules about the maintenance of bridges and roads, because even kings needed to get their carts to market without getting stuck in a muddy pothole. There were also provisions for the church, guaranteeing its freedom from royal interference, a nod to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who helped mediate the deal. And perhaps most intriguingly for modern readers, Clause 61 established a council of 25 barons who could monitor the king's compliance and, if he broke the charter, seize his castles and possessions until he made amends. Think of it as the original Watchdog Committee, except the watchdogs wore chainmail and had a personal stake in the outcome. If you're enjoying this deep dive into medieval parchment and its modern legacy, why not smash that like button? It helps the channel grow, and it lets us know you want more episodes like this. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you never miss a new What Is drop. Back to the Magna Carta. The signing. Now, the moment you've been waiting for, the signing. Imagine a vast field at Runnymede, the river glinting like a polished shield under intermittent bursts of sunshine. King John, dressed in his finest, though likely still a bit damp from the morning's mist, sits on a raised stool, surrounded by a semicircle of barons, whose expressions range from stern determination to barely concealed smirk. The charter is read aloud in Latin, a language most of the barons understood about as well as a modern teenager understands their grandparents' slang. A few nod politely, others exchange glances that say, "Did he really just say that?" When it comes time to affix the royal seal, John hesitates. Legend has it, he muttered something along the lines of, "Fine, I'll sign it, just don't expect me to actually follow it." He presses his seal onto the parchment, the wax melting into a blob that, according to one chronicler, looks suspiciously like a disappointed frown. The barons, meanwhile, erupt in a mixture of relief and triumph. Some raise their goblets of ale, others clap each other on the back, perhaps a little too hard, given the weight of their mail. A few peasants nearby, curious about the commotion, pause their ploughing to watch, wondering if this strange piece of paper will mean fewer taxes, or just a new excuse for the Lord to hunt deer in their fields. What happened next? If you thought the signing was the end of the story, think again. The Magna Carta was less a peace treaty and more a ceasefire that lasted about as long as a snowball in hell. King John, ever the opportunist, almost immediately appealed to Pope Innocent III, arguing that the charter undermined his God-given authority and was therefore null and void. The Pope, ever keen to assert his own supremacy over secular rulers, obliged and issued a papal bull annulling the Magna Carta in August 1215, just a few months after it was sealed. John, feeling vindicated, went back to his old ways, reneging on promises and even seizing some of the barons' lands. The barons, unsurprisingly, were not pleased. They invited Prince Louis of France, the future Louis VIII, to invade England and claim the throne, hoping a foreign monarch would be more amenable to their demands. By mid-1216, Louis controlled London and much of the southeast, while John clung to the west, desperately trying to hold on to his crumbling kingdom. Then fate intervened. In October 1216, while crossing the treacherous Wash estuary, John lost a significant portion of his treasure, including allegedly the crown jewels, to the rising tide. A few days later, he fell ill with dysentery, likely from indulging in too much peach and too little hygiene, and died at Newark Castle on October 19, 1216. With the king dead, the barons rallied behind his 9-year-old son, Henry III. The Regency government, led by the formidable William Marshall, reissued the Magna Carta in November 1216, this time in a slightly trimmed-down version, removing some of the more obstructive clauses, like the infamous Clause 61 that allowed the barons to wage war on the king. The charter was reaffirmed again in 1217, and finally, in 1225, under Henry III's own reign, a definitive version was issued that would become the basis for future iterations. So while the original 1215 charter was quickly annulled, its core ideas proved stubbornly resilient, like a weed that keeps sprouting no matter how many times you pull it. Influence and importance. Fast forward a few centuries, and the Magna Carta begins to show up in places its medieval authors could never have imagined. In the 17th century, English parliamentarians, locked in a struggle with the Stuarts over royal prerogative, dusted off the charter as a precedent for limiting monarchical power. Sir Edward Coke, a formidable jurist, proclaimed in his Institutes of the Laws of England that Magna Carta was the Great Charter of Liberties, a foundational stone upon which the common law rested. When the English Civil War erupted and eventually led to the execution of Charles I, the Charter's echo could be heard in the arguments that no king is above the law. Across the Atlantic, the American colonists, fuming over British taxation without representation, invoked Magna Carta as a symbol of their ancestral rights. The phrase "no taxation without representation" can be traced back to the Charter's insistence that taxes could only be levied with the consent of the kingdom's Common Council. When Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, he leaned heavily on the idea that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed, a concept that, while Enlightenment born, owed a debt to the medieval barons' insistence on consent for taxation. The United States Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights, mirrors many Magna Carta principles: the guarantee of due process, Fifth Amendment, protection against unlawful imprisonment, Sixth Amendment, and the notion that justice cannot be bought or denied, Seventh Amendment. Even the famous habeas corpus provision, protecting individuals from indefinite detention, finds its spiritual ancestor in Clause 39 of the original Charter. Beyond the Anglosphere, the Magna Carta's influence rippled outward. In 1948, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights echoed its call for equality before the law and the prohibition of arbitrary detention. Courts in India, Canada, Australia, and beyond have cited Magna Carta when interpreting constitutional guarantees of liberty and fairness. It's also become a cultural touchstone. From the iconic image of King John reluctantly placing his seal on the parchment to countless references in movies, television shows, and even video games, the Magna Carta has become shorthand for the moment people said, "Enough." But let's not romanticize it too much. The original Charter primarily protected the privileges of feudal barons, not the peasantry, not women, not serfs. Its language was rooted in a hierarchical society where free men were a minority. Yet its genius lay in its adaptability. Each generation could reinterpret its broad principles to expand the circle of who deserved protection under the law. In that sense, the Magna Carta is less a static contract and more a living conversation about power, accountability, and rights, a conversation that thankfully is still ongoing. Before we reveal today's bonus fact, a quick reminder: your support keeps these videos coming. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, and ring the notification bell so you're alerted whenever we upload a new explainer. And of course, share this video with anyone who thinks history is boring. We promise to prove them wrong. Thanks for watching, and now for the secret nugget you've been waiting for. Bonus fact: did you know that the original Magna Carta was written on a single sheet of parchment made from sheepskin, and that the ink used was a mixture of oak gall, iron sulfate, and gum arabic? A recipe so stable that over 800 years later, the text is still legible. In fact, some of the surviving copies still show the faint impressions of the barons' seals, making them not just legal documents, but also medieval fingerprints of descent. That's all for this edition of What Is. I hope you've enjoyed this journey from a soggy meadow at Runnymede to the courtrooms of today. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, even the most powerful kings can be held accountable by a piece of sheepskin and a lot of stubborn barons. See you next time.